Hello, my friends. How are you? And welcome to Crimes with Cole. So how are you guys doing today? I hope you guys all are having an amazing day. So in today's case, we are going to be talking about the case of Betty Lou Beets, the Black Widow of Texas. Talk about till death do you part. She found herself taking that phrase literally. Not once, but twice. Betty was born as Betty Lou Dunvan on March 12th, 1937 in Roxborough, North Carolina, to her mother Margaret and her father James. She had an older brother along with a younger brother and sister. And at the age of 3, Betty Lou had lost her hearing due to measles. And her father began sexually abusing her at the age of 5. And at this time is when the family decided to move to Virginia. James got a job as a machinist at a research center, and this is when Margaret had 2 more children, Betty's little brother and little sister. Now, after having Betty's younger brother and sister, this is where James and Margaret decided to settle down and raise their 4 children, or so they thought. When Betty was 12 years old, Margaret was institutionalized due to a psychotic mental break, leaving Betty to care for her younger brother and sister, who were only 4 and 2. Can you imagine being 12 years old, having to take care of your 2 younger siblings while attending school and doing housework? And then your father abusing you the way he is. Your mother is institutionalized, so you really don't have a woman to look up to cry and confide in about the struggles of transitioning into this young lady. But she did it. And when Betty turned 15 years old, she had married a man named Robert Franklin Branson just after finishing 9th grade. Oh, goodness. A year later, at the age of 16, Betty had her first child, a little girl named Faye. With what should have been her teenage years, quickly turned into motherhood and wifely duties. Betty started to rebel, and she would go out any chance she could and try to get that small ounce of the teenage dream back. A freedom that she would never get ended up causing resentment between her and Robert, turning the relationship sour. She ended up separating from Robert for 6 months. And during that 6 months, Betty had attempted an act of self-harm. And this brought Robert back, and Betty and Robert decided that they wanted to be together and work things out. And soon after, when Betty was 17, in 1954, they had another little girl and named her Connie. The 4 of them decided to move down to Texas a year later. And over the next 10 years, Betty and Robert had 3 more children: Shirley, Phyllis, and Robert II. The couple had their 6th and final child in 1966, a little boy named Bobby. Betty claimed that her marriage to Robert was abusive and made her miserable. In 1969, Betty and Robert divorced. The newly single 31-year-old Betty started drinking and was now out on the prowl for her freedom, but ended up finding a new man. That new man turned out to be Billy York Lane. The two married in July of 1970, and by October, she had gotten a restraining order against her new husband. The two ended up divorcing later that year. Now, even though the two divorced, they still indulged in the on-again, off-again romance that consisted of jealousy, mind games, and violent abuse. And that would last for the next year. In June of 1971, Billy had ended up breaking Betty's nose. Still, going back to the toxic relationship, the violent acts between the two only grew. And in January of 1972, Betty claims Billy saw her out at the bar with another guy and rushed to her house that night, threatening to kill her. But according to Billy, Betty called him up, begging and pleading for him to come over, and when he got there, she pulled a gun on him. Either way, Betty shot Billy that night twice. And while attempted murder charges were placed on Betty, Billy did the unimaginable, signing an affidavit dropping those charges and stating that Betty's version was right and that he in fact threatened her before she shot him. Oh my God. Betty was then charged with aggravated assault. And when the trial was over, the two toxic lovebirds re-wed, and this time around, the marriage only lasted for 1 month. Oh my gosh, oh my gosh, let's just keep going. Now, the single again Betty Lou was back on the prowl once again. Now 36, with 2 failed marriages and 6 wonderful kids, Betty met Prince Charming in November of 1973 named Ronnie Threlkeld, and the two were wed in February of 1978. And Betty's wild side took over again, causing her to become a topless dancer. Ronnie wasn't able to handle Betty's highs and lows. It seems a lot of people weren't able to handle Betty's highs and lows. Betty was a hard one to grasp. In 1979, Betty tried to run Ronnie over with her car. Ronnie filed for divorce, and the two divorced later that year. While most people would have given up on love, Betty was determined to find her next victim. Her husband. Husband number 4 came along in October of that same year. She does not waste time. Very shortly after the divorce from Ronnie, husband number 4's name was Dole Wayne Baker. And the two were quick to marry and even quicker to separate. The two separated 7 weeks after getting married. Betty was in a serious car accident in January of 1980. She was married in October, separated 7 weeks later, so by now, like late November, early December, and in a serious car accident that caused a serious head injury in January. Ugh, and even though the head injury was serious, the two divorced by July of 1980. Not even a year. Not even a year of marriage. A little over a year goes by since the divorce, and in October of 1981, Betty killed Dole and buried him in the backyard. She put Dole under a shed that she had built the year prior. And on August 19th of 1982, Betty marries Jimmy Don Beets. And almost a year later, ends up killing Jimmy. She confessed to her daughter that Jimmy was an extremely abusive man and she couldn't stand being with him anymore. But she wasn't going to let him kick her out of her house. So instead, she was going to put an end to him. Betty had used a .38 caliber to take the life of Jimmy one night after he had fallen asleep in bed. And just like she did with Dole, she had wrapped his body up in a blue sleeping bag and waited for the right time to take them to their appointed grave by yours truly. Except this time, she convinced her daughter Cheryl to help her move Jimmy's body to the wishing well out in the front yard. She then had her son take some of Jimmy's heart medication and leave it in their boat and then leave the boat stranded out on the lake. They lived by a lake, making it look like Jimmy had fallen off of the boat while out on the lake and drowned. Betty had reported Jimmy missing, and the police searched for him for 3 weeks. And in 1985, 2 years after Jimmy was killed, Betty was charged with his murder. When the police had searched her property, they found Jimmy and Dole. Charging her with both murders, Betty went to trial in 1985 for the murder of Jimmy Don Beets and was sentenced to death in October of 1985. So she never went to trial for the murder of Dole Wayne Baker, her ex-husband, and Betty's children felt their mother got in an unfair trial. They felt she was a victim of abuse by all of her husbands and her father when she was a child and did not receive a good attorney. Betty was executed by lethal injection in 2000. And all of the Baker and Beets children were present and said that they felt like a weight had been lifted off of their shoulders once they knew Betty was gone. They wanted the world to know their fathers were not bad men. Betty seemed to have a mean streak in her from the very start. And I don't know if she would have ever been remorseful for her actions had she have not received the death penalty. But let me know what you guys think. That's a pretty wild case. She is a pretty wild gal. But I'm slightly curious if she was crazy in the aspect that everyone knew and everyone told these men, you probably need to kick her to the curb, don't keep her around too long, or if she was just crazy behind closed doors and people were like What do you mean you guys fight all the time? So, let me know what you guys think, how crazy you think she is. But until next time, please remember to be safe, and I will see you then. Bye.